My sister took my 7-year-old daughter shopping for a birthday gift and returned to the house carrying nothing but designer shopping bags. When I asked where my child was, she reapplied her lip gloss and smirked. Oops, I left her at Target. My mother just sipped her mimosa and laughed, claiming my daughter was getting too much attention anyway. They thought leaving a child alone in a massive retail store was a perfectly acceptable way to settle a petty family jealousy. I did not scream. I did not cry. I pulled out my phone and made exactly one phone call to the man who owned the very roof over their heads. 30 minutes later, my sister was sobbing on the driveway, and my mother lost all the color in her perfectly contoured face. Before I share how one phone call dismantled their entire lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind your toxic family exactly who they are dealing with. I am Camille, 33 years old, and a forensic accountant who has spent my entire professional life tracking missing assets and exposing financial fraud. But nothing in my career could have prepared me for the moment the missing asset was my own flesh and blood. The afternoon sun was pouring through the massive arched windows of my mother Vivian's Atlanta estate. It was a sprawling property situated in the heart of Buckhead, paid for entirely by my grandfather's commercial real estate empire. I was standing in the marble foyer checking my watch when the heavy double doors swung open. My younger sister Kendra strutted inside. She was 29, draped in a fresh-off-the-runway outfit swinging 4 large boutique shopping bags. Right behind her was her husband Liam, a 32-year-old white man, whose primary occupation seemed to be spending my family's wealth on failed business ventures while wearing expensive boat shoes. They were laughing about some joke, their voices echoing off the vaulted ceiling. I looked past them, expecting to see my 7-year-old daughter Aaliyah trailing behind with her little violin case. She had gone with them 2 hours earlier because Kendra insisted on buying her a special dress for Grandpa Jeremiah's upcoming philanthropic gala. I looked through the glass doors at the circular driveway. The luxury SUV was parked and locked. The doors were closed. "Where is Aaliyah?" I asked, my voice calm but laced with a sudden sharp edge. Kendra paused halfway to the sweeping staircase. She set down a shopping bag, pulled a compact mirror from her purse, and calmly began reapplying her lip gloss. She met my eyes in the mirror and gave a careless little smirk. Oops, I left her at Target. The words hung in the air. For a fraction of a second, my brain refused to process the sentence. "You left a 7-year-old child at Target?" I asked, taking a slow step forward. My mother, Vivian, strolled into the foyer from the sunroom. She was 55, dressed in her usual immaculate country club attire, holding a crystal flute filled with a fresh mimosa. She did not look alarmed. She looked thoroughly amused. "Good," Vivian said, taking a delicate sip of her drink. She was getting too much attention anyway. "Your grandfather would not stop talking about her reading level at dinner last night. It is exhausting. A little time waiting by the customer service desk will teach her some independence." My blood turned to ice. My daughter Aaliyah is a brilliant, observant little girl who reads 3 grade levels ahead and plays the violin with a passion that brings my grandfather to tears. She is the light of my life and the undisputed favorite of Grandpa Jeremiah. That favoritism, earned simply by being a genuine and talented child, was the catalyst for the relentless jealousy that rotted my mother and sister from the inside out. They had intentionally abandoned my child in a massive, crowded retail store because my grandfather had praised her intellect. The sheer, unadulterated malice of it was breathtaking. This was not the first time my sister had weaponized abandonment. I remembered my college graduation day clearly. Kendra had promised to pick me up from my apartment. She never showed. I ended up sprinting 3 miles across town in my cap and gown because she deliberately turned off her phone to go get her nails done with my mother. They had told me then that I needed to learn how to handle my own logistics. But I was 22 then. Aaliyah was 7. The rules of engagement had fundamentally shifted. I did not launch into a screaming match. As a forensic accountant, I am trained to remove emotion from crisis and focus purely on execution. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. Liam stepped into my personal space, puffing out his chest in that entitled way he always did when trying to assert dominance in a house he did not own. "Relax, Camille," he said, letting out an exasperated sigh. "You are being completely dramatic. The kid is 7, she knows her own name, she can find a security guard or customer service. It is a good character building exercise, do not blow this out of proportion. My mother nodded in agreement, carefully stepping around the spot where she would eventually drop her glass. Exactly, Vivian chimed in. You are raising her to be arrogant. Just yesterday she corrected my pronunciation of a French word in front of the pastor's wife. It was utterly humiliating. A child needs to know her place in the hierarchy. Kendra thought a time out at the store would be a good lesson in humility. I stared at the three of them. A grown woman, her enabling mother, and her opportunistic husband, standing in a multi-million-dollar mansion, casually justifying child endangerment to protect their fragile egos. You left a little black girl alone in a massive public space in today's world to teach her humility. I stated, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. You left my daughter unattended because her intelligence threatened your vanity. Kendra rolled her eyes, clearly bored with my reaction. Oh, please stop playing the victim. Target is perfectly safe. You are just mad because you always overreact. You have always been the dramatic one in this family. Go get in your little sedan and fetch her if you are so worried. I have a massage appointment in an hour, and I am not letting your bad energy ruin my afternoon. That was the precise moment the last remaining thread of family loyalty snapped. I had spent 33 years swallowing their insults, taking the high road, and keeping the peace. I had built a highly successful career untangling complex corporate fraud, while they spent their days draining the family trust. I had stayed quiet out of respect for my grandfather. But they had crossed the one boundary I would never negotiate. I pulled my phone from my blazer pocket. Liam stepped forward again, reaching out as if to snatch the device from my hand. Who are you calling? The police? Go ahead. They will laugh at you. It is a misunderstanding. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked Liam dead in the eye. Touch me and you will lose that hand, I promised quietly. He froze, his bravado faltering for a split second. I dialed Jeremiah's private line. My grandfather Jeremiah was a self-made commercial real estate mogul who had clawed his way up from nothing in segregated Atlanta to build an empire. He suffered no fools, and he absolutely despised Vivian's obsession with high society status. He respected me because I had refused his money to pay for my education, choosing to earn my own degrees and build my own firm. The line connected. The phone was on speaker, the volume turned all the way up so it echoed off the marble walls of the foyer. Camille. Jeremiah answered. The background noise of a boardroom fell silent on his end. I am in the middle of a quarterly review. What is the emergency? Grandpa, I said, keeping my voice steady and devoid of the panic tearing at my chest. I need your security team. Kendra and Liam just returned to the Buckhead estate. They deliberately left Aaliyah alone at the Target on Peachtree Street. Mother explicitly stated they did it to punish Aaliyah because she was receiving too much of your attention. They abandoned her there intentionally. The silence that followed was absolute. It was not just quiet. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum that seemed to suck the air right out of the room. I watched the arrogant smirk slide off Kendra's face, replaced by a sudden dawning terror. Liam uncrossed his arms, standing up straight, his face draining of color. Vivian stood frozen, the crystal flute trembling in her manicured hand. When Jeremiah finally spoke, the underlying rage in his tone was palpable. I am dispatching the private security team to that store immediately, he commanded. The boardroom background was entirely silent now. Then his voice sharpened into a blade directed straight at the people standing in front of me. Vivian, Kendra, pack your bags. You have exactly 30 minutes to vacate my estate. If you are still on the property when I arrive, I will have you removed for trespassing. The crystal flute slipped from Vivian's fingers. It hit the marble floor, shattering into countless pieces, the sweet mimosa splashing across her expensive designer shoes. Kendra opened her mouth to argue, to deploy her usual tears, but I had already ended the call. The countdown had begun, and their perfect parasitic lives were about to burn to the ground. I sprinted out of the foyer before the shattered glass of my mother's mimosa had even settled on the marble. My heels hit the driveway pavement in a dead run toward my sedan. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely get the key into the ignition, but the moment the engine roared to life, a terrifying calm washed over me. This was the same cold clarity that took over when I found millions of dollars missing in corporate ledgers. Only this time, the missing asset was my 7-year-old daughter. I threw the car into reverse and tore out of the Buckhead Estate gates. The drive to the Peachtree Street Target was a blur of screeching tires and blaring horns. As I wove through Atlanta traffic, my mind automatically began cataloging the data, connecting the past to the present. My sister Kendra had a documented history of weaponized incompetence. She loved to conveniently forget things when it served her vanity. I remembered standing in the pouring rain outside my college graduation venue 11 years ago, clutching my diploma case to my chest to keep it dry. Kendra was supposed to pick me up. I waited for 2 hours. When I finally walked 3 miles to a diner and called her, she laughed over the phone saying she scored a last-minute appointment with her nail tech and completely lost track of time. My mother had defended her, then claiming I was old enough to figure out my own logistics and that I should stop trying to ruin Kendra's self-care day with my manufactured drama. I swallowed that humiliation because I was 22 and desperate for their approval. But abandoning a grown woman in a rainstorm is a microaggression. Abandoning a 7-year-old black child in a massive retail store filled with strangers is a fatal line crossed in the sand. My grip on the steering wheel tightened until my knuckles turned white. They had not forgotten Aaliyah. They had discarded her to punish her for being loved by the one man whose money they worshipped. I slammed the brakes in the Target parking lot, leaving my car parked haphazardly across 2 spaces. I sprinted through the sliding red doors, my eyes scanning the massive expanse of the store. A sudden wave of nausea hit me, but then I saw them. Standing like 2 impenetrable fortresses near the customer service desk were Marcus and David, the lead agents of my grandfather's private security detail. They were flanking the store manager, who looked completely overwhelmed by the sudden arrival of armed men in tailored suits. And sitting on a red plastic stool, swinging her feet and clutching a small bag of gummy snacks, was Aaliyah. I dropped to my knees the moment I reached her, pulling her tiny body into my chest so hard I knocked the breath out of both of us. The raw animal terror that had been gripping my lungs finally shattered. I buried my face in her braids, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo. She wrapped her little arms around my neck, patting my back like she was the mother and I was the child. "I am okay, Mommy," she whispered against my collarbone. I tried to find Auntie Kendra in the clothing section, but she walked away really fast. The nice lady at the register let me use the phone. She walked away really fast. The words echoed in my head. It was not a distraction. It was a deliberate abandonment. I kissed Aaliyah's forehead, standing up and taking her hand. I nodded to Marcus and David, thanking them with a look they instantly understood. The store manager tried to hand me a clipboard for an incident report, but I politely declined. The entity responsible for this incident was not a random kidnapper. It was the woman who shared my bloodline, and the police could not give me the kind of justice I was about to exact. The ride back to the estate was silent. Aaliyah fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted by the adrenaline. I looked at her in the rearview mirror and felt the last remaining drop of daughterly affection evaporate from my soul. What replaced it was a pure, calculated fury. I was a forensic accountant. I dismantled empires for a living. I was going to strip my mother and sister of everything they valued until they had nothing left but the ugly truth of their own reflections. When I pulled back into the circular driveway of the estate, it looked like a war zone. 4 of my grandfather's black security SUVs were parked on the manicured lawn. Piles of Louis Vuitton luggage, designer shoeboxes, and velvet garment bags were being unceremoniously tossed onto the cobblestones. Kendra was standing by the fountain, screaming hysterically at a stone-faced security guard. Her perfect blowout was ruined, her mascara streaked down her cheeks. My mother Vivian was pacing near the front columns, frantically dialing her phone and shouting at the operator. The moment Vivian saw my car, she dropped her phone and rushed toward me, stepping over a pile of cashmere sweaters. "Camille," she gasped, her voice shrill with a panic I had never heard before. "Camille, you have to call him off. He canceled my platinum cards. The guards are literally pushing my things out the door. You have to tell your grandfather it was just a simple misunderstanding." I stepped out of the car, locking Aaliyah safely inside. I stood on the driveway looking at the woman who had given birth to me. Her eyes were wide, pleading desperately for me to play my usual role of the family peacekeeper. She reached out to grab my arm, but I stepped back, letting her hand grasp empty air. "We are family, Camille," she pleaded, her voice cracking as she tried to weaponize our culture against me. "We are Black women. We have to stick together against a world that wants to tear us down. You cannot let your grandfather use his security team to throw your own mother onto the street like a common criminal. We resolve our issues inside the house. Do not let your pride destroy this family." I stared right through her frantic performance. My voice dropped to a whisper that cut through the noise of the dragging luggage. "You stopped being family the second you left my child in aisle 4. Do not ever invoke solidarity to me again. You are not a victim, mother. You are a liability." Kendra ran over, sobbing loudly, trying to grab my blazer. "Camille, I swear I just turned around and she was gone. I had a panic attack. I was going to go back for her. I promise I was going to go back." "Save the tears for your Instagram followers, Kendra," I said, swatting her hand away as if it were a disease. "You walked away really fast." Those were Aaliyah's exact words. "You left a little girl to fend for herself because you were jealous that an old man praised her violin playing. You are 29 years old and you have the emotional regulation of a toddler. Enjoy packing." Suddenly, the heavy oak front door banged open. Liam stormed out, dragging a set of golf clubs and an overflowing duffel bag. His face was beet red, sweating profusely through his expensive linen shirt. His usual smug arrogance had completely vanished, replaced by the frantic energy of a cornered rat. He threw the golf clubs onto the driveway, the metal clattering loudly against the stone. "You cannot do this!" he yelled, marching toward me with his finger pointed directly at my face. "You and that crazy old man cannot just lock the gates and throw us out without notice. I know my rights. This is a wrongful eviction. We have established residency here. I will call the police and I will sue Jeremiah for every dime he has. I will drag this entire family through the mud in civil court." I did not back down. I tilted my head, studying the sheer panic radiating from his pores. "You're going to sue a billionaire real estate mogul with a team of corporate lawyers on retainer?" I asked softly. "On what grounds, Liam? With what money? Your credit cards were just declined by the security gate scanner." Liam's chest heaved as he frantically looked between me, his weeping wife, and my horrified mother. He was spiraling, losing control of the narrative and the luxury lifestyle he had leached off of for years. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a desperate, threatening hiss. "You cannot kick us out of this specific property, Camille. You do not understand what you are messing with. You cannot change the locks. The primary business accounts are registered to this address." The world around me seemed to stop spinning. The sounds of Kendra crying and the security guards moving boxes faded into white noise. My professional auditor instincts flared, coming to life like a siren in the dark. The primary business accounts. My grandfather's massive property management firm was headquartered in a high-rise downtown. All of his legal entities and corporate trusts were tied to that commercial address, not this residential estate. Liam did not have a job. He claimed to be an entrepreneur, building a tech startup, but he spent his days playing golf and driving Kendra to luxury boutiques. There was absolutely no legitimate reason for any primary business accounts to be legally registered to my mother's residential address, unless someone was hiding something massive, something illegal, something desperate enough to make a man threaten a billionaire. "What business accounts, Liam?" I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. The gravel crunched under my heels, sounding like breaking bones in the sudden quiet of the driveway. "You do not have a job. You call yourself a venture capitalist, but your last 3 startups folded before they even secured a web domain. And Grandpa Jeremiah's property management funds are strictly routed through the downtown firm." I watched the blood drain from his face. His pale skin turned a sickly shade of gray, and a heavy bead of sweat rolled down his temple. He opened his mouth to speak, but his jaw just worked soundlessly. He had panicked. He had tried to use legal jargon to intimidate me completely, forgetting that he was screaming at a certified forensic accountant. "Liam," I said, keeping my voice at a deadly whisper, "are you running shell companies out of my mother's residential basement?" Vivian rushed forward, inserting herself between us like a human shield. "Do not interrogate him, Camille. He is under a lot of stress. Liam manages very complex portfolios for your grandfather. Things you would not understand with your little corporate desk job. Mother, I smiled, a razor-sharp expression that held zero warmth. I track offshore embezzlement for Fortune 500 companies. If Liam is running Grandpa's money through this address, he is not managing a portfolio. He is committing federal wire fraud. Liam took a staggering step backward, nearly tripping over his own discarded duffel bag. He looked at Vivian, his eyes wide with absolute terror. The arrogant savior complex, he usually paraded around my family, had vanished completely. He realized he had just handed me the key to his own prison cell. Before I could press him further, a shrill, dramatic sob pierced the heavy Atlanta air. I turned to see Kendra. Having realized that her husband had just effectively signed their death warrant, she resorted to the only weapon she actually knew how to use: public manipulation. She had propped her phone against a stack of Louis Vuitton luggage on the driveway. The red light of an Instagram live broadcast was already blinking. She dropped to her knees on the cobblestones, perfectly arranging her angles, so the harsh afternoon light caught the tears streaming down her face. I just need everyone to pray for us right now. Kendra wailed into the camera, her voice trembling with practiced theatricality. My sister is trying to destroy our family. I had a severe medical emergency today. A massive panic attack in the middle of Target. My vision went black. I could not breathe. I got disoriented and separated from my niece for barely 2 minutes. And instead of checking on my mental health, my sister called an armed security team to terrorize me. I stood there staring at her performance. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. She was not a woman who had abandoned a 7-year-old child. In her broadcast, she was a fragile victim of a health crisis, being ruthlessly persecuted by a jealous older sister. I watched the comments rolling in on her screen. Her church friends and socialite followers were already sending prayer hand emojis and condemning me for being heartless. She has always been jealous of me, Kendra sobbed, wiping her eyes delicately to avoid ruining her makeup. Just because I have a loving husband and a beautiful life. Now she is manipulating our grandfather into kicking us out on the street. We do not even have anywhere to go tonight. Please share this. People need to know how toxic she is. Vivian immediately stepped into the frame, wrapping her arms around Kendra and looking mournfully into the camera. We are staying strong through the grace of God, Vivian told the viewers. Some people just have darkness in their hearts. We tried to love Camille, but she refuses to heal. 10 years ago, this kind of public shaming would have broken me. I would have frantically tried to defend myself, to explain the truth to deaf ears. But today I felt absolutely nothing. Their opinions were as bankrupt as their morals. I did not interrupt her broadcast. I did not yell. I simply turned my back on them and walked toward my car. They were fighting a public relations war on the internet, while I was preparing to fight a financial war in federal court. As my hand touched the door handle, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out. The caller ID simply read Jeremiah. I answered immediately. Are they out of the house yet? My grandfather's voice barked through the receiver. Security is tossing the last of their bags now. I reported, my tone purely professional. Kendra is crying on the internet, and Liam just accidentally confessed to running unapproved business accounts out of the residential estate. A heavy silence stretched across the line. I could hear the faint hum of city traffic through his office window. When Jeremiah spoke again, the anger had hardened into something cold and lethal. Leave them in the driveway, he commanded. Get Aaliyah home safe, then come downtown to my penthouse office immediately. Use the private elevator. I am on my way, I said. I ended the call and got into my car. Aaliyah was still fast asleep in the back seat, her chest rising and falling peacefully. I locked the doors, put the car in drive, and pulled away from the estate without looking back at the pathetic spectacle on the lawn. Let them cry to their followers. Let them play the victims. The real reckoning was about to begin. The drive downtown took 20 minutes. I dropped Aaliyah off at my secure high-rise apartment, leaving her with my trusted nanny Maria, who had been with us since Aaliyah was a toddler. I gave Maria strict instructions not to open the door for anyone matching my mother or sister's description. Then I drove straight to the financial district. Jeremiah's corporate headquarters occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming glass skyscraper that dominated the Atlanta skyline. I bypassed the main reception and used my grandfather's private keycard to access the executive elevator. It shot upward with silent efficiency, depositing me directly into the penthouse suite. The office was a fortress of dark mahogany leather and panoramic views of the city he had helped build from nothing. Jeremiah was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his hands clasped behind his back. At 76 years old, he was an imposing figure with a sharp mind that missed absolutely nothing. He turned as I entered. He did not offer a hug or empty platitudes. We were long past that. Sit, he instructed, pointing to one of the leather chairs facing his massive desk. I sat down, crossing my legs and maintaining my posture. He walked over to a heavy steel safe in the corner of the room, punched in a keypad code, and pulled out a towering stack of thick leather-bound ledgers and 3 encrypted hard drives. He carried them to the desk and dropped them in front of me with a heavy thud. I have suspected for months that the numbers on the residential maintenance accounts were bleeding, Jeremiah said, his voice low and tight. I thought it was Vivian overspending on her country club renovations. I tolerated it because she is my daughter, and I promised your late grandmother I would ensure she was comfortable. But Liam running primary business accounts through my residential address. That is not overspending, Camille. That is structural theft. I looked down at the encrypted drives. My fingers actually tingled with anticipation. If he is routing funds outside the corporate umbrella, he is likely using shell companies to mask the withdrawals, I explained, shifting fully into my element. He would need authorized access to bypass the firm's internal controls. Mother must have given him the administrative passwords you set up for her trust. Jeremiah's jaw clenched so hard a muscle twitched in his cheek. The betrayal from his own daughter was a bitter pill, but he swallowed it whole. He tapped a thick finger against the top ledger. They look at me and they see a senile old man with deep pockets, he said, leaning over the desk until he was eye level with me. They think because I am aging, I have lost my grip on this empire. They think they can use my legacy as a personal piggy bank while simultaneously leaving my great-granddaughter alone in a store. He pushed the stacks of ledgers directly across the mahogany wood until they touched my fingertips. I want you to take a leave of absence from your firm, Jeremiah stated, his eyes locking onto mine with absolute authority. I am hiring you as an independent auditor with full unrestricted access to every single account under my holdings. I want you to trace every dollar. I want you to audit everything Vivian, Kendra, and Liam have touched in the last 10 years. I placed my hand flat on top of the ledgers. The leather was cool to the touch. And when I find the fraud, I asked softly. Jeremiah did not blink. Burn them to the ground. I took a formal leave of absence from my firm the very next morning. My managing partner did not ask questions. When a senior forensic accountant requests immediate personal leave, you grant it. By noon, I had transformed Jeremiah's executive boardroom into a financial war room. The mahogany table was buried under decades of banking statements, tax returns, and encrypted hard drives. I ordered 3 separate monitors to be wheeled in and connected them to my secure laptop. I was not just looking for Liam's recent theft. I was digging into the bedrock of my family's financial history. For 3 days, I barely slept. I survived on black coffee and the sheer adrenaline of peeling back the layers of my mother's deception. Vivian had treated Jeremiah's commercial empire like her personal piggy bank. I found thousands of dollars categorized as property management consulting fees that were actually routed straight to her personal stylist. There were invoices for structural repairs on downtown high-rises that matched the exact dates and amounts of Kendra's luxury European vacations. It was sloppy, arrogant theft. They truly believed nobody would ever check the math. While I was busy following the money, Vivian was busy launching a full-scale social warfare campaign. She knew she could not intimidate me directly, so she deployed her most reliable weapon: the elite church community of Atlanta. In our circles, reputation is currency. Vivian had spent 30 years cultivating an image as the flawless, devoted matriarch, sitting in the front pew every Sunday, in custom hats and designer suits. My phone started vibrating on the 3rd afternoon, and it did not stop. Vivian had activated the flying monkeys. First came the text messages from Sister Patrice, the head of the church hospitality committee. Camille, I heard about the terrible misunderstanding with your sister. You need to come home and apologize to your mother. The devil is using your pride to tear a beautiful black family apart. Do not let jealousy poison your soul. Then came the voicemails from Auntie Loretta, a woman who was not blood-related but wielded immense power in my mother's social club. Camille, your mother is weeping. She is distressed. You are a successful woman now, but you must never forget to honor your mother. Kicking your sister out on the street over a simple mistake with a child is ruthless. You need to pray for a softer heart. I listened to the voicemails while highlighting fraudulent transactions on my screen. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I felt disgusted. Vivian had spun a masterful narrative painting herself as the heartbroken peacemaker, and me as the cold corporate monster, holding a grudge over a simple babysitting error. She completely omitted the part where she and Kendra intentionally abandoned Aaliyah at Target. She conveniently forgot to mention Liam threatening to sue my grandfather. They wanted me to cave under the weight of cultural guilt. They wanted me to worry about my reputation in the community. But I stopped caring about the opinions of those women the day I realized their conditional love was just a tool for control. I did not engage. I did not defend myself. I simply went down my contact list and blocked every single one of them. I blocked Sister Patrice. I blocked Auntie Loretta. I blocked the pastor's wife. I severed the social cord with a few taps on my screen, shutting out the noise so I could focus entirely on the numbers. The numbers never lied. They did not gaslight. They did not manipulate. It was 2 in the morning on my 4th day in the war room. The city of Atlanta was a quiet ocean of lights outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. The only sound in the office was the hum of the servers and the rapid clicking of my keyboard. I was tracing a secondary trust account that Vivian had managed years ago. It was supposed to be a secure educational fund set up by Jeremiah for my college expenses. I was scrolling through the transaction history when my eyes caught a massive discrepancy. A single untraceable wire transfer. The amount was staggering. It had been pulled from the educational trust exactly 8 years ago. I froze. My hand hovered over the mouse. The date on the screen burned into my retinas. I knew that date. I remembered it with vivid, sickening clarity. 8 years ago, I was standing in the financial aid office at my university. I was a junior carrying a double major and fighting for top honors. The financial aid officer had looked at me with deep pity and informed me that my tuition check had bounced. The trust account was completely empty. I had called my mother in a complete panic standing in the hallway outside the bursar's office. Vivian had answered the phone crying hysterical tears. She told me there had been a catastrophic market crash. She claimed the investment portfolio managing my college fund had collapsed overnight. She said she was heartbroken, but there was absolutely nothing she could do. I believed her. I was 21 years old and I trusted my mother. I scrambled to take out massive high-interest student loans to finish my degree. I worked 3 separate jobs. I waitressed on weekends, I tutored underclassmen, and I did data entry on night shifts, just to afford my textbooks and rent. I nearly worked myself into a hospital bed while finishing my forensic accounting degree. All because I thought we had suffered a tragic financial loss. I stared at the glowing monitor in the dark office. The wire transfer was not a market crash. The money did not vanish into a failed investment portfolio. The funds had been deliberately extracted and routed through a third-party holding account. My heart hammered against my ribs as I typed furiously, running the routing numbers through the secure tracking software I used for corporate audits. I stripped away the layers of financial obfuscation Vivian had tried to build. She was not a criminal mastermind. She was just a greedy woman who thought a few fake vendor names would hide her tracks. The tracking software pinged. The destination account was unmasked. The funds had been wired to an offshore account registered in the Bahamas. I pulled up the corresponding vendor identification. It was an exclusive luxury resort and event planning group based in Nassau. The puzzle pieces snapped together with a violent, sickening force. 8 years ago was the exact same year Kendra and Liam got married. Kendra had demanded a lavish destination wedding. She wanted a week-long celebration on a private beach with hundreds of guests flown in from Atlanta. At the time, I wondered how Liam, a man who was unemployed even back then, could afford such an extravagant event. Vivian had claimed Liam's family contributed to the costs. That was a lie. My mother had drained my entire college trust fund. She stole the money meant for my education, the money that Jeremiah had set aside specifically for my future. She stole it and handed it directly to a luxury resort in the Bahamas to pay for Kendra and Liam's multi-million-dollar wedding. She let me drown in student debt. She watched me work until my hands bled and my eyes blurred from exhaustion. She watched me struggle to feed myself during my senior year, all so her favorite daughter could have custom floral arrangements and an open bar on a white sand beach with her useless white husband. I sat back in my chair. The air in the room felt thin. I did not cry. I had shed my last tear for my mother a long time ago. The emotion that flooded my veins was not sorrow, it was absolute apocalyptic rage. Vivian had stolen my past. She had stolen my peace. And just a few days ago, she had tried to endanger my daughter. I printed the bank statement. The printer hummed, spitting out the single piece of paper that held the key to my mother's destruction. I picked it up, folding it perfectly, and sliding it into my designer bag. The flying monkeys wanted me to respect my elders. They wanted me to bow my head and keep the peace in the name of family. They had no idea that I was about to walk into their world and shatter it to pieces. I was sitting at a corner table overlooking the pristine 18th hole of the Oakwood Heights Country Club. I did not go there looking for a public spectacle. I went because the managing director of a massive logistics firm had requested a lunch meeting to discuss hiring my independent forensic accounting services. I was wearing a tailored charcoal blazer, sipping sparkling water and projecting the absolute professional authority that my mother had always tried to diminish. The dining room was a sea of crystal chandeliers, heavy linen tablecloths, and the hushed, wealthy chatter of Atlanta society. I was halfway through my presentation when the ambush happened. Vivian and Kendra did not just casually bump into me. They had tracked my location, presumably through one of my mother's many country club informants. They marched across the dining room, flanked by three of Vivian's most loyal society friends. They moved with the coordinated precision of a military strike team designed to publicly execute my reputation. Vivian stopped right at my table. She did not bother to lower her voice. In fact, she projected it perfectly, so that the surrounding tables, the local politicians, the corporate lawyers, and the wealthy socialites could hear every single syllable. Camille, she cried out, placing a manicured hand over her chest. I cannot sleep. I cannot eat. How could you do this to your own family? How could you manipulate your grandfather into throwing your sister out on the street? Kendra stood slightly behind her, wiping away a completely invisible tear. We just want our family back, Camille. We forgive you for being so jealous. We just want you to get the psychological help you desperately need. The surrounding tables went dead silent. The women flanking my mother nodded in solemn agreement, murmuring about the tragedy of a broken home and the disrespect of modern children. My potential client shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unsure of how to handle the sudden influx of reality television drama invading his business lunch. Vivian and Kendra were playing the ultimate game of social extortion. They expected me to crack. They expected me to yell, to defend myself, to cause a scene that would confirm their narrative of the angry, unstable daughter. They knew that in our community, causing a public scene in front of the elders was the ultimate sin. If I raised my voice, I lost. If I walked away, I looked guilty. I slowly placed my fork down on the porcelain plate. I wiped the corners of my mouth with a linen napkin. I did not look at the gossiping women. I locked eyes directly with Vivian. You are interrupting my lunch, Mother. I stated, my voice perfectly modulated, calm, and terrifyingly polite. Vivian scoffed, leaning closer to the table to ensure the entire dining room caught her next performance. Your lunch. Your niece is traumatized. Your sister is practically homeless, and you are sitting here eating a salad like you did not just tear a knife through the heart of this family. We are Black women, Camille. We do not throw each other to the wolves for the white man's amusement. She was playing the ultimate cultural card, trying to shame me with the weight of racial solidarity while simultaneously excusing her own cruelty. It was a beautiful performance, but I had brought props. I reached into my designer bag. I did not rush. I let the silence stretch out agonizingly long. I pulled out the single sheet of paper I had printed at 2 in the morning. The bank statement. The undeniable proof of a felony. I folded it neatly into a small square and slid it directly across the white tablecloth, stopping right under Vivian's salad plate. "What is this?" Vivian demanded, her voice dripping with aristocratic disdain. "Another one of your petty little lists." I stood up from my chair. I leaned across the table until my face was inches from hers. I ignored the gasps of the society women standing behind her. I lowered my voice so that only she and Kendra could hear the poison I was about to deliver. "Open it," I whispered. Vivian snatched the paper from under her plate and snapped it open. I watched her eyes track across the highlighted numbers. I watched her read the routing number, the offshore account details, the exact dollar amount of my stolen college tuition, and the vendor identification for the luxury resort in the Bahamas. I watched the arrogant, righteous matriarch of Atlanta high society die inside her own skin. The transformation was instantaneous and absolute. Her breath hitched. The hand holding the paper began to tremble so violently, the paper shook like a leaf in a hurricane. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving behind a pale ashen mask of pure terror. I leaned in closer, my lips barely an inch from her ear. "I know exactly who paid for the Bahamas, Mother," I said, my voice a lethal calm. "I know you stole my college fund to finance Kendra's wedding. I have the digital footprint. I have the routing numbers. I have the timestamps. Keep talking. Say one more word about family loyalty to this dining room, and I will hand this directly to the IRS and the district attorney. You will trade that Chanel suit for a federal jumpsuit by Friday." Vivian went completely rigid. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The air seemed to evaporate from her lungs. She looked at me with a stark primal fear. I was no longer the scapegoat daughter she could bully. I was her executioner. I held the keys to her freedom, and she knew with absolute certainty that I would not hesitate to turn the lock. But Kendra was standing on the other side of Vivian, completely oblivious to the paper in our mother's hand. Kendra only saw that Vivian had stopped speaking and assumed I was winning the verbal argument through sheer intimidation. Kendra could not stand losing the spotlight. Kendra sneered, tossing her expensive extensions over her shoulder, her voice rising in defensive arrogance. "You can threaten us all you want, Camille. You are just bitter because you are sitting here eating a salad while Liam's new startup is about to make us millions. We do not need Grandpa's house or his money anyway. Liam is closing a massive funding round next week. We are going to be richer than all of you combined." I froze. My eyes darted from Vivian's terrified face to Kendra's smug, oblivious expression. "Liam's new startup is about to make us millions." My auditor instincts screamed like a fire alarm in a silent building. Liam did not have a startup. Liam did not have investors. Liam had a series of shell companies and a habit of funneling my grandfather's property management funds into his own pockets. Kendra had absolutely no idea. Liam was lying to his own wife about where his sudden influx of cash was coming from. He was telling her he had angel investors, when in reality he was actively embezzling from Jeremiah's commercial accounts. I realized right then that Liam was not just a parasite. He was a reckless liability operating completely unchecked. He had fed his wife a delusional fantasy of wealth to cover his financial crimes, and she was loudly broadcasting it to the world. Kendra had just handed me the exact thread I needed to pull to unravel his entire existence. I looked at Kendra, her chin tilted up in that familiar posture of unearned superiority. She truly believed her white husband was a tech genius on the verge of a massive payout. She had built her entire identity on the illusion of his success, completely blind to the fact that his success was financed by stolen money. I did not correct her. I did not laugh. I simply stared at her with a look of profound surgical pity. "Is that so, Kendra?" I asked softly. "Well then, I suggest you hold on to that money very tightly. You are going to need every single cent of it for legal fees." I turned back to my client, who had watched the entire exchange in stunned silence. "I apologize for the interruption," I said, projecting absolute calm. "Shall we move this meeting to my private office downtown? The coffee is much better, and the environment is entirely pest-free." My client nodded eagerly, grabbing his briefcase and standing up. He wanted nothing more than to escape the radioactive tension radiating from my family. I picked up my bag and walked past my mother. Vivian was still frozen, staring at the bank statement in her trembling hand. She did not look up. She did not say a word. Her society friends exchanged confused, panicked glances, entirely unsure of how the powerful matriarch had been silenced by a single piece of paper. I walked out of the country club with my head held high, the sound of my heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floors. The war had officially shifted. Vivian was neutralized, paralyzed by the threat of federal prison. But Kendra's arrogant declaration had just opened a massive new vulnerability. I needed to get back to the war room in Jeremiah's penthouse. I needed to pull up the banking records for Liam's so-called startup. If he was closing a massive funding round next week, it meant a massive fraudulent transfer was about to hit the accounts. I was going to follow the money, and I was going to watch his entire world burn. I left the country club in my rearview mirror. The silence inside my car was heavy, but my mind was operating at terminal velocity. Kendra's arrogant voice echoed on a continuous loop in my head. She truly believed Liam's new startup was about to make them millions. I pressed the accelerator harder, navigating the dense Atlanta traffic with singular focus. I know exactly how fake tech entrepreneurs operate. They do not magically close massive funding rounds without leaving a massive digital footprint. And Liam was not nearly smart enough to sweep his digital crumbs. He was a man who relied entirely on his wife's family wealth to project an image of success. I knew with absolute certainty that his upcoming financial windfall was not coming from Silicon Valley venture capitalists. It was coming directly from us. I walked back into Jeremiah's penthouse office and locked the heavy double doors behind me. The 3 monitors on the mahogany conference table were still glowing, waiting for my next command. I bypassed the general ledger and dove straight into the vendor payout systems for the commercial real estate portfolio. Forensic accounting is not about looking at the front door of a business. It is about crawling through the plumbing. You have to look for the leaks, the slow drips, the misdirected pipes. I ran a global search on the registered name of Liam's supposed tech company. The system returned 0 hits in the direct payroll or standard vendor files. I did not stop there. I pulled up the public business registry for the state of Georgia and cross-referenced the corporate identification number. The tech startup was completely hollow. There were no payroll records, no operational expenses, no product development patents. It was a ghost ship registered to a commercial mailbox service. But hidden in the subsidiary filings, I found the anchor. The tech company was listed as the parent organization for 3 other limited liability corporations registered in Delaware and Wyoming. They had incredibly bland, invisible names designed to avoid scrutiny. I plugged those 3 shell company names directly back into Jeremiah's master corporate ledger. The 3 monitors lit up with hundreds of transaction hits spanning the last 4 years. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart hammering a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. The shell companies were not selling software. They were listed as preferred maintenance contractors for my grandfather's commercial real estate portfolio. I watched the numbers align, forming a perfect, undeniable picture of systemic theft. Liam had been submitting hundreds of fraudulent invoices month after month. There were payouts for routine air conditioning upgrades at the suburban strip malls. There were massive checks cut for roof replacements on the industrial parks. There were consistent billing cycles for structural assessments on the downtown high-rises. I pulled up the physical maintenance logs for those specific buildings and compared them against the billing dates. The work was never done. The roofs were never replaced. The air conditioning units were still the original models installed 20 years ago. Liam was not a tech genius closing a funding round. He was a glorified con artist siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars directly out of my grandfather's maintenance budget. I was using the stolen funds to pay for Kendra's designer bags, his own luxury vehicles, and their completely fabricated high society lifestyle. I sat back in the heavy leather chair. The cold air conditioning in the penthouse suddenly felt freezing. The sheer scale of the embezzlement was staggering, but the logistics of it presented a terrifying reality. A randomer cannot just insert themselves into a multi-million-dollar corporate payout system. My grandfather's firm had strict internal auditing controls. New vendors required a Level 5 administrative clearance to be approved and added to the automated billing cycle. Jeremiah held the primary key. He signed off on every major legitimate contract. The only other person on the planet with a level 5 clearance was Vivian, my mother. She held a proxy key strictly for emergency operational continuity in the event of my grandfather's passing. I pulled the digital authorization logs for the exact dates the shell companies were added to the system. There it was. Vivian's unique user identification code had manually overridden the standard vetting process. She authorized every single one of Liam's fake companies. My stomach churned with a mixture of disgust and profound sorrow for my grandfather. Vivian had not just stolen my college tuition. She had actively conspired to drain the family empire from the inside out. Jeremiah had built this real estate portfolio during segregation. He fought tooth and nail for every square foot of Atlanta soil, facing down systemic racism and redlining to build generational wealth for his descendants. And Vivian handed the digital keys to the kingdom to an entitled white man who wore loafers without socks. She traded her own father's sweat and blood to keep her golden daughter happy. She facilitated the theft of a black empire to fund the fragile ego of a mediocre man, simply because she cared more about Kendra maintaining the illusion of a wealthy marriage than she cared about her own father's legacy. I needed concrete, undeniable proof of the wire fraud to hand over to federal authorities. I could not just bring spreadsheets to the FBI. I needed the signatures. I started downloading the fraudulent invoices, isolating the digital footprints attached to each submission. Liam was arrogant and sloppy. He used the exact same internet protocol address for submitting the fake invoices that he used to access his personal social media accounts. The trail led directly back to the wireless router at my mother's residential estate. I opened the master asset file to trace where the largest batch of payments had been funneled over the last 30 days. I needed to see exactly how much capital Liam was preparing to steal for his fake funding round. I navigated to the primary folder for Jeremiah's flagship downtown property. It was the crown jewel of the portfolio, a massive commercial tower that generated the highest revenue in the company. As the folder opened on my screen, a red flag notification flashed aggressively across the top of the financial dashboard. It was a high-priority alert from the corporate banking portal indicating a newly registered financial encumbrance on the asset. I froze. My hands hovered over the keyboard. The flagship property was fully owned. Jeremiah had paid off the commercial mortgage a decade ago. It was a point of immense personal pride for him. He refused to leverage his primary asset for any reason. I clicked on the flashing red notification and downloaded the attached document. A massive digital file opened on my center monitor. It was a bank authorization form for a second commercial mortgage. The loan amount was $50 million. The funds had been fully approved and authorized for release just 3 days ago. My breath caught in my throat. Liam was not just skimming maintenance fees off the top anymore. He was trying to steal the entire building. He was cashing out the empire. I scrolled rapidly through the 60-page legal document, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted banking terms and the corporate liability clauses. I bypassed the standard boilerplate language and went straight to the final signature page. The authorization required the direct approval of the primary property owner. I stared at the bottom of the screen. The signature on the dotted line read Jeremiah in bold black ink, but I have stared at my grandfather's handwriting my entire life. I know the exact sharp angle of his letters and the heavy pressurized slant he uses when he signs official corporate documents. The signature glowing on my monitor was perfectly symmetrical, completely lacking the natural pressure variations of a 76-year-old man. It was a high-resolution digital copy and paste job. It was a blatant sloppy forgery, but a $50 million commercial loan requires massive banking compliance. It requires background checks, identity verification, and secondary authorization. A forged signature alone could never bypass a commercial lending department. Liam could not have executed a loan of this magnitude by simply uploading a fake document to a web portal. He had to have someone working on the inside. He had to have a partner at the bank. I printed the $50 million mortgage authorization and walked straight out of the war room. I bypassed the executive assistants and pushed open the heavy double doors to Jeremiah's private office. He was on a conference call with overseas investors. I walked right up to his massive desk, placed the single sheet of paper directly over his daily planner, and tapped my index finger on the forged signature. He glanced down, annoyed at the interruption, but the moment his eyes registered the document, the entire temperature of the room dropped. He hung up the phone without saying a single word of goodbye to his partners. I watched my grandfather trace the outline of the fraudulent ink stroke. I braced myself for an explosion. I expected him to shatter his coffee mug against the wall or summon his private security team to drag Liam out of whatever luxury boutique he was currently haunting. Instead, Jeremiah leaned back in his leather chair. The silence was absolute. When a man who built an empire out of nothing goes perfectly quiet, you are witnessing the calm before a catastrophic storm. He looked up at me, his eyes dark and flat. Liam signed away my legacy, he stated. It was not a question. He forged it, I corrected, keeping my voice entirely surgical. He leveraged the downtown flagship tower for a $50 million cash injection into his shell companies. Mother's administrative access could not approve a loan this massive, so he bypassed the corporate threshold entirely by faking your direct authorization. Jeremiah did not flinch. He slowly folded his hands on the desk. I spent my life fighting men who looked exactly like Liam, he said quietly. Men who thought they could take what I built because they felt entitled to the fruits of black labor. I bled for that downtown property. I laid the foundation when the banks in this city would not even look at me. And Vivian brought a parasite right into my living room and handed him the keys. He pushed the paper back toward me. I am stepping out of this, Camille. You are the auditor. You are the architect of this reckoning. I give you absolute uncontested authority to handle this situation. Do not just stop the transfer. I want him ruined. I want them all ruined. I took the document and marched back to the war room. A forged signature is just a piece of paper, but $50 million in liquid capital is a massive logistical operation. Commercial lending requires extensive compliance checks, corporate verification, and secondary audits. A mediocre grifter like Liam could never walk into a major financial institution and walk out with that kind of cash just by smiling and handing over a fake document. He had to have help from the inside. I opened a new terminal and traced the bank routing numbers attached to the loan origination file. The funds were cleared through a specific private wealth management branch located in the affluent northern suburbs of Atlanta. I pulled the public corporate registry for that specific branch and cross-referenced the executive staff with Liam's digital footprint. It took me less than 12 minutes to find the connection. The senior loan officer who authorized the $50 million mortgage was a man named Preston. I ran a quick social media sweep. Preston and Liam were fraternity brothers from their college days. They were golf buddies. Their wives went to the same upscale Pilates studio. Liam had leveraged his network of entitled friends to bypass the bank's internal compliance department. Preston had rubber-stamped a fraudulent commercial loan because his buddy asked for a favor, undoubtedly in exchange for a massive kickback once the funds cleared the shell companies. The sheer arrogance was staggering, but it was exactly the kind of unearned confidence that made them extremely sloppy. They relied on the good old boys network to protect them completely, underestimating the black woman tracking their every digital move. I needed to lock the cage before the rats realized they were trapped. I made a secure call to a high-powered corporate attorney I had worked with on previous federal embezzlement cases. His name was Sterling, and he hated white-collar criminals as much as I did. We met in a private room at a downtown steakhouse. I slid the entire dossier across the table. I showed him the forged documents, the shell company routing numbers, the internet protocol addresses leading back to my mother's estate, and the undeniable connection to Preston at the bank. Sterling reviewed the file, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "This is a masterpiece of stupidity," he murmured. "Wire fraud, bank fraud, identity theft, and criminal conspiracy. It is a federal grand slam." I leaned forward. "I do not want to just cancel the transaction. If I cancel it now, Liam will claim it was a misunderstanding, and Vivian will bail him out with her personal funds just like she always does. I want him to cross the point of no return. I want federal charges." We executed a strategy known as an invisible legal freeze. Through the attorney's federal connections, we placed a silent hold on the destination accounts. To Liam and Preston, the corporate banking portal would show the $50 million as fully cleared and available for withdrawal. The digital numbers would sit right there on their mobile screens, feeding their delusions of grandeur. But the moment Liam actually tried to move that money into his personal accounts or spend a single dime of it, the transaction would trigger an automatic federal red flag. The funds were locked in a digital purgatory. Liam thought he was a multimillionaire, but in reality, he was just a man holding a ticking time bomb. I drove back to my apartment late that evening, the adrenaline of the trap still coursing through my veins. Aaliyah was safe and asleep in her room, completely unaware of the absolute war I was waging to protect her future. I poured myself a glass of red wine and stood by the window watching the Atlanta skyline glow against the night sky. The Empire was safe and the thieves were about to walk right off a steep cliff. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. The screen lit up with a notification. I had blocked her on my primary accounts, but she loved using secondary burner numbers to try and bypass my boundaries. She could not stand the thought of me ignoring her. I opened the message. It was a high-resolution photo. Kendra was posing in the driveway of a luxury car dealership. She was wearing oversized designer sunglasses and holding up a set of shiny keys. Behind her sat a brand-new custom-ordered Porsche. Her husband Liam stood next to her, wrapping his arm around her waist, flashing that arrogant, punchable smile. The caption underneath the photo was perfectly curated for maximum spite. God blesses those who do not hold grudges. Be better, Camille. We are moving up in the world. I stared at the screen. I did not feel a single ounce of anger. I actually laughed out loud, the sound echoing through my quiet apartment. Kendra thought she was making me jealous. She thought she was proving her superiority and validating her husband's fake success. She had absolutely no idea that you cannot purchase a $150,000 sports car without initiating a massive bank transfer. By buying that Porsche, Liam had just attempted to withdraw funds from the frozen federally monitored account. He had officially crossed the legal line from attempted fraud to active actionable money laundering. Kendra had not just sent me a petty text message to rub her fake wealth in my face. She had just provided me with time-stamped photographic evidence of her husband spending stolen federal funds. She had beautifully documented her own demise. I took a slow sip of my wine and saved the photo directly to the federal evidence folder. The trap had just snapped shut. Sunday morning arrived with the suffocating humidity typical of Atlanta. But the real heat was waiting inside the massive vaulted sanctuary of Greater Hope Fellowship. This mega church was the absolute epicenter of Atlanta high society. It was a place where multi-million-dollar deals were brokered in the vestibule, and reputations were either solidified or destroyed before the choir even finished the opening hymn. This was my mother Vivian's undisputed kingdom. She had spent 3 decades cultivating an image of flawless devout grace, sitting in the front pew every single week in custom-tailored suits and extravagant hats. I did not want to be there. I had absolutely no desire to step foot inside a building where my mother held court. But Aaliyah had been selected to perform a violin solo for the youth ministry showcase, and I would never allow my daughter to stand on a stage unsupported simply because her grandmother was a toxic narcissist. We arrived early, and I deliberately chose a seat in the very last row of the balcony, intentionally keeping a massive physical distance between us and the VIP section at the front where Vivian, Kendra, and Liam were currently seated. Aaliyah played beautifully. Her small fingers moved across the strings with a precision and passion that brought tears to my eyes. When she finished and took her bow, the congregation erupted in applause. She beamed, walking down from the stage and settling into the seat right next to me. I squeezed her hand, feeling a profound sense of pride and an ironclad determination to protect her peace at all costs. But the moment of joy was fleeting. The service transitioned to the testimony portion of the morning. This was an open microphone segment traditionally meant for expressing gratitude or sharing personal breakthroughs. But Vivian had a very different agenda. She was already feeling the financial squeeze. My grandfather Jeremiah had effectively cut off her access to his primary estate, and the tertiary accounts she usually treated like her personal ATM were suddenly throwing error codes every time she tried to swipe her platinum cards. She did not know about the federal trap I had set for Liam yet, but she knew I was the one conducting the forensic audit. She knew the walls were closing in. So, like a cornered predator, she decided to go on the offensive using the congregation as her personal army. Vivian stood up, smoothing down her lavender silk skirt, and walked gracefully to the microphone at the front of the altar. She dabbed the corners of her eyes with a lace handkerchief, ensuring every single camera in the sanctuary caught her performance on the giant projection screens. Church family, she began, her voice trembling with practiced theatricality. I come to you today with a heavy, broken heart. The devil is actively working to destroy my home, and he is using the sin of pride to do it. A murmur of sympathetic amens rippled through the pews. I sat frozen in the balcony watching my mother weaponize our community. My eldest daughter Camille has allowed corporate greed and a hardened heart to blind her to the sanctity of Black family unity. Vivian continued, perfectly projecting her voice, so it echoed off the stained glass windows. Earlier this week, a simple, harmless misunderstanding occurred. My youngest daughter, Kendra, became separated from her niece in a crowded store for just a few moments. It was a terrifying accident. But instead of showing grace, Camille used her influence with her grandfather to throw her own pregnant sister and her hardworking husband out onto the street. She has severed our family over a petty grudge. Please pray for my lost, vindictive daughter. Pray that God softens her ruthless heart before she destroys the very people who love her most. The entire congregation gasped. Hundreds of heads began to turn, swiveling around in their pews, scanning the room, until their eyes collectively locked onto me sitting in the back row. The judgmental stares were physically heavy. The older women whispered behind their programs, shaking their heads in disgust. Vivian had successfully painted herself as the heartbroken matriarch and framed me as a cold corporate monster tearing a vulnerable family apart over a simple babysitting error. She expected me to shrink. She expected me to grab my daughter and run out the back doors in tears, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of public shame. She remembered how I used to cower when she pulled these stunts during my childhood. I remembered standing on this exact same altar when I was 16 years old, forced to publicly apologize to the youth group because Vivian found my hidden savings account and told everyone I was stealing from her. In reality, I had been hiding my meager paychecks from my after-school job just to buy my own winter coat because she refused to pay for anything that did not directly benefit Kendra. She had always used public humiliation to break my spirit and enforce compliance. But I was no longer a terrified 16-year-old girl. I was a 33-year-old forensic accountant holding the digital execution orders for her entire fake life. I did not break eye contact with my mother. I reached down and picked up my designer handbag. I took Alia's small hand in mine. "Come on, baby girl," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "We are leaving." I did not slip out the back exit. I guided Alia out of the pew and we walked straight down the center aisle of the sanctuary. The rhythmic clicking of my heels echoed sharply against the marble floor, cutting through the thick, judgmental silence of the congregation. The whispers died instantly. People physically leaned back in their seats as I passed, projecting an aura of absolute, unbothered, lethal grace. I marched directly toward the front row. Vivian was still standing near the microphone, dabbing her dry eyes. Kendra was sitting in the VIP pew, looking incredibly smug. Liam sat next to her, a self-satisfied grin plastered across his face. He actually crossed his arms, leaning back, as if he had just won a major victory. They truly believed they had broken me. They thought the social pressure of Atlanta's elite would force me to drop the audit and beg for their forgiveness. I stopped right in front of Vivian. She looked down at me, a flash of triumphant victory dancing in her eyes. She opened her mouth, preparing to offer me some fake pious forgiveness in front of the watching crowd. I did not raise my voice. I did not justify my existence or defend my character to the hundreds of strangers watching our every move. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a small, sleek silver flash drive. I held it up for a fraction of a second, ensuring Vivian saw exactly what it was before I dropped it perfectly into her lap. It landed with a soft thud against her expensive lavender silk skirt. I leaned forward, bringing my face mere inches from hers. The scent of her expensive floral perfume was nauseating, but I did not blink. That drive contains the unredacted Internet Protocol logs of Liam logging into Grandpa Jeremiah's commercial accounts directly from your home network router. I whispered my voice, a terrifying razor-sharp calm that only she could hear. It also contains the time-stamped authorization codes you personally used to approve his fraudulent shell companies. You have exactly 48 hours before my forensic audit goes completely public and the federal warrants are issued. Vivian's triumphant smile completely evaporated. Her jaw practically unhinged. The color drained from her face so fast, she looked like she might actually pass out right there on the altar. She looked down at the small silver flash drive sitting in her lap, as if it were a live grenade actively ticking down to zero. Kendra leaned forward, confused by the sudden drastic shift in our mother's demeanor. "What is that?" Kendra hissed, trying to grab the drive. Vivian snatched it first, her hands trembling violently. She could not speak. The realization that she had just publicly attacked the woman holding the keys to her federal indictment paralyzed her vocal cords. I shifted my gaze to Liam. His smug smirk had collapsed. He sat up straight, his eyes darting frantically between my face and the flash drive tightly clutched in Vivian's shaking fist. He knew exactly what Internet Protocol logs meant. He knew I had found the digital breadcrumbs he thought he had so cleverly hidden. The arrogant white savior complex melted away, leaving behind the raw, unfiltered panic of a man who realized he had just picked a fight with a predator. "Enjoy the rest of the service, Mother," I whispered. I stood back up, squeezed Aaliyah's hand, and continued walking straight past the altar, exiting through the prominent side doors without ever looking back. The silence in the sanctuary was deafening. The congregation had witnessed the entire exchange, but nobody knew exactly what had been said. All they saw was the powerful, unshakable matriarch completely crumble into a trembling mess, while the supposedly disgraced daughter walked out with the posture of a reigning queen. The heavy wooden doors closed behind us, blocking out the suffocating atmosphere of the church. The morning air outside was fresh and grounding. I walked Aliyah to my sedan, secured her safely in the back seat, and got behind the steering wheel. I took one deep, cleansing breath. The social war was over. The financial slaughter had officially commenced. Just as I put the key in the ignition, my phone began to ring. The screen lit up, displaying Liam's phone number. He had not waited to get home. He was calling me from inside the sanctuary, probably hiding in a bathroom stall, while Vivian hyperventilated in the front pew. I let it ring 3 times, savoring the sheer desperation radiating through the digital signal. I tapped the screen and accepted the call. I did not say a word. Camille, his voice was breathless, high-pitched and completely frantic. The arrogant drawl he always used when addressing me was entirely gone. He sounded like a man drowning in deep water. I listened to his ragged breathing. The sound of his terror was the sweetest music I had heard in years. "The bank accounts are frozen." Liam gasped his words, tumbling over each other in sheer panic. "The commercial portal is throwing a federal compliance error code. I cannot access the 50 million. I cannot even access my personal checking accounts. What did you do?" "The bank accounts are frozen." "What did you do?" Liam demanded through the phone. His voice was completely stripped of its usual arrogant drawl. He sounded breathless and high-pitched, like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and realized gravity was not a suggestion. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I maintained the exact same vocal register I use when presenting audit findings to a corporate board. I told him to meet me in exactly 45 minutes at a high-end artisan coffee shop in Midtown Atlanta. I chose the location deliberately. It was public enough that he could not resort to physical intimidation, but exclusive enough that the tables were spaced far apart for absolute privacy. I hung up the phone before he could argue and drove straight to the cafe. I arrived 15 minutes early. I ordered a double espresso and seated myself at a corner table with my back to the wall, giving me a full view of the entrance. I smoothed my tailored blazer and placed a thick manila folder perfectly in the center of the table. When Liam finally walked through the glass doors, he looked absolutely catastrophic. The wealthy, carefree venture capitalist facade had completely dissolved. His linen shirt was wrinkled and stained with sweat under the arms. His eyes were bloodshot, darting frantically around the quiet cafe before locking onto me. He did not walk over. He practically stumbled, marching toward my table with a desperate, aggressive energy. He threw himself into the chair across from me. He leaned forward, planting his hands flat on the table, trying to use his physical size to loom over me. "You need to undo whatever hack you ran on my accounts right now," he hissed. His breath smelled of stale coffee and pure panic. "You have absolutely no idea what kind of fire you are playing with, Camille. You think because you run some spreadsheets for a living, you can mess with my business operations. I will call the managing partners at your accounting firm today. I will tell them you are having a mental breakdown. I will tell them you are conducting rogue, unauthorized audits and harassing your family. I will ruin your professional reputation before lunch." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my espresso. I let the warm, bitter liquid settle in my throat before I set the ceramic cup down on its saucer. The porcelain made a sharp click against the wood. I looked at the sweating, shaking man sitting across from me. I had spent my entire adult life watching mediocre men like Liam use loud voices and empty threats to cover up their profound incompetence. He actually believed his privilege was a bulletproof shield. Hai thought he could bully a black woman out of holding him accountable for stealing from her own bloodline. "Are you quite finished?" I asked, my voice holding the icy calm of a winter morning. Liam opened his mouth to launch another threat, but I raised my hand, silencing him instantly. I slid the thick manila folder across the table until it touched his fingertips. "Open it," I commanded. He stared at the folder as if it were a loaded weapon. His shaking fingers fumbled with the clasp. He flipped open the cover, and his eyes immediately dropped to the top document. It was a printed summary of the invisible legal freeze I had executed alongside the corporate attorney. Below that was a copy of the forged $50 million commercial mortgage. Below that were the unredacted routing numbers for his shell companies cross-referenced with his personal internet protocol addresses. I watched his eyes track the lines of text. I watched his pupils dilate in absolute horror as his brain finally caught up to his reality. "You committed wire fraud across state lines, Liam," I said, keeping my tone conversational but lethal. "You committed money laundering, identity theft, federal banking fraud. You did not just steal a few maintenance fees. You attempted to leverage a $50 million commercial property with a forged signature." "That is a lie," he stammered, pushing the folder away as if the paper was burning him. "You cannot prove any of this. My loan officer approved everything. It was a legitimate transaction." I smiled, a razor-thin expression that did not reach my eyes. "Your loan officer. You mean Preston, your old fraternity brother at the private wealth branch." I leaned slightly closer to the table. "Do you really think a mid-level bank manager is going to risk federal prison for you?" Preston took one single look at the dossier my attorney handed him this morning. He saw the federal indictments we had drafted. He saw the evidence of the kickbacks you promised him. "Your frat buddy flipped on you in less than 5 minutes, Liam. He is already cooperating with our lawyers to save his own skin. He handed over every email, every text message, and every voicemail you ever sent him regarding this scheme." Liam stopped breathing. The color drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, translucent gray. He slumped back in his chair, all the fight completely leaving his body. The realization that he was totally isolated crashed down on him. There was no backup plan. There was no wealthy father-in-law to bail him out. There was just him and the federal crimes he had documented so beautifully. His survival instinct kicked in, overriding whatever microscopic shred of loyalty he had left for his wife and my mother. He leaned forward again, but this time his posture was entirely submissive. He lowered his voice, looking around the cafe as if the FBI were already hiding behind the espresso machines. "Camille, listen to me," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "You have to understand. I did not do this alone. I am not the mastermind here. Vivian gave me the administrative proxy keys. I could not have bypassed the internal controls without her. She physically logged into the portal from her laptop and authorized the shell companies. She knew exactly what I was doing. I kept my face perfectly blank, betraying no emotion as he eagerly threw my mother under the bus. And Kendra," he continued, speaking faster and faster, desperate to trade his family for his freedom. "Kendra demanded the money. Do you have any idea how much it cost to keep her happy? The designer closed the vacations, the cars. She knew I was not making money from the startup. She knew the cash was coming from your grandfather's accounts. She told me to take it. She told me Jeremiah owed it to her because he favored you and Aaliyah. They manipulated me, Camille. They used me to get what they wanted. He reached across this table, his sweaty palms upturned in a pathetic gesture of surrender. I can help you, he whispered urgently. I can be your star witness. I will testify against Vivian. I will give you sworn statements proving Kendra knew about the stolen money. I will hand over all my devices. Just release the freeze on my personal checking account. Let me keep the new Porsche and let me walk away from this clean. You do not need to press charges against me. We can destroy them together. I sat back in my chair. I looked at the man my sister had chosen to marry. He was willing to send his pregnant wife and his mother-in-law to federal prison just to keep a sports car and save himself. It was a level of cowardice that was almost breathtaking to witness in real time. I slowly reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out my phone. The screen was illuminated. The red light of the voice memo application was blinking steadily. The timer showed that I had been recording for the last 12 minutes. Liam stared at the recording app. His jaw went slack. A low, distressed sound escaped his throat. I picked up my phone and tapped the screen, saving the audio file directly to my secure cloud server. I stood up from the table, smoothing out my clothes. I looked down at him, shivering in his expensive linen shirt. I do not make deals with parasites, I said, my voice echoing with finality. I turned and walked away, leaving the manila folder on the table. I did not look back as I exited this coffee shop, but I could hear his ragged, hyperventilating breaths all the way to the door. He was a dead man walking, and he knew it. I got into my car and locked the doors. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold, calculated focus. Liam's confession was the final piece of ammunition I needed. I had the financial records, I had the internet protocol logs, I had the recorded audio of the conspirators turning on each other. The trap was fully loaded. All I needed now was the proper stage to execute the final blow. I pulled up the calendar on my phone interface. The date was circled in bright red. This coming Saturday was Grandpa Jeremiah's annual philanthropic gala. It was the most prestigious event in Atlanta high society. Every major politician, real estate mogul, and corporate executive in the state would be in attendance. Vivian and Kendra had been bragging about their custom gowns for months. They viewed the gala as their personal red carpet, an opportunity to flaunt their status and pretend they were the royalty of the city. They had absolutely no idea that they were walking into a public slaughter. I started the engine and pulled out into the midday traffic. The final reckoning was set. I was going to let them put on their diamonds and smile for the cameras. And then I was going to drop the guillotine in front of everyone they had ever tried to impress. Saturday evening arrived with a crisp, cool breeze that swept through the heart of downtown Atlanta, but inside the grand ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel, the atmosphere was suffocatingly hot with wealth and ambition. This was not just a dinner. This was Grandpa Jeremiah's annual philanthropic gala, the undisputed crown jewel of the city's social calendar. The room was a sea of bespoke tuxedos and floor-sweeping couture. Senators, corporate titans, and the absolute elite of Black Atlanta were packed into the venue, mingling under cascading crystal chandeliers, while a live jazz band played smoothly in the corner. For 3 decades, my grandfather had used this exact night to flex his philanthropic muscle, distributing millions in grants to community developers in historically Black colleges. Vivian floated through the crowd like she owned the building. She was draped in a custom emerald green gown, her neck heavy with diamonds that were undoubtedly paid for by the very commercial maintenance funds I had spent the week auditing. She was smiling, air-kissing cheeks and posing for the society photographers with practiced perfection. She believed she was completely safe. I watched her from the mezzanine level before making my descent. I knew exactly how my mother's mind operated. She had convinced herself that Jeremiah was far too obsessed with his pristine public legacy to ever air our family's dirty laundry in a room full of politicians and investors. She thought the silent freeze on her accounts and the quiet eviction from the estate were the extent of her punishment. In her narcissistic reality, the gala was a neutral zone, a sanctuary protected by the unwritten rules of high society decorum. Kendra was right by her side, clutching a glass of vintage champagne. She was wearing a sequined dress that caught every flash of the cameras, loudly laughing at jokes that were not funny. She was actively playing the role of the successful tech founder's wife, completely oblivious to the fact that her husband was standing 3 feet behind her, looking like a dead man walking. Liam was sweating through his tailored tuxedo. He was gripping a glass of scotch so tightly his knuckles were white. He had spent the last 48 hours trapped in a prison of his own making, knowing I held the audio recording of his full confession and the digital footprint of his federal wire fraud. He darted his eyes nervously around the ballroom, terrified of every shadow waiting for the federal agents he knew were coming. But he had not told Kendra. I was too much of a coward to ruin her perfect night, choosing instead to drink himself into a stupor while she bragged to the mayor's wife about their new Porsche. I did not wear sequins or diamonds. I walked down the sweeping marble staircase wearing a structurally flawless floor-length black gown that projected absolute lethal authority. I held Aaliyah's hand. She was wearing a beautiful velvet dress, her hair perfectly braided, looking around the grand ballroom with wide, intelligent eyes. We did not sneak in through the side doors like Vivian would have preferred. I walked straight down the center of the room, my heels striking the polished floor with a steady, rhythmic cadence. I was not there to socialize. I was there to execute a corporate takeover and a public execution simultaneously. I remembered attending this gala 10 years ago when I was fresh out of college, drowning in the student debt my mother had forced upon me. Vivian had made me stand near the coat check, claiming there were not enough seats at the family table for me, while she paraded Kendra around the room, introducing her to wealthy heirs. Tonight there was a reserved seat with my name on it at the absolute center of the VIP section, directly next to Jeremiah's chair. As Alia and I approached the front of the ballroom, Vivian spotted me. Her perfect, practiced smile tightened into a thin, brittle line. She quickly turned her back, pretending to be deeply engrossed in a conversation with a city councilman trying to orchestrate a social freeze-out. But Kendra, fueled by champagne and unearned arrogance, could not resist the opportunity to secure her place in the hierarchy. She stepped directly into my path, blocking my way to the head table. She looked me up and down, her lips curling into a vicious, condescending sneer. "Look who finally decided to show her face in polite society," she whispered loudly, ensuring the wealthy women at the adjacent tables could hear every toxic syllable. "I guess you realized you cannot survive out there in the real world without Grandpa's money. You are probably here to beg him for your inheritance back after throwing that massive tantrum at the church. Do not embarrass yourself, Camille. I is not going to forgive you for treating our family so poorly. Just sit in the back and stay out of the photos." I did not raise my voice. I did not break my stride. I stopped inches from her face, looking past her perfectly contoured features, straight into the eyes of her husband, standing just behind her shoulder. Liam flinched physically, stepping backward and nearly knocking over a waiter holding a tray of hors d'oeuvres. "I am not here to beg for anything, Kendra," I said, my voice a smooth, icy whisper that sent a visible shiver down Liam's spine. "I am here to balance the books. I suggest you find a seat. You are going to want to be sitting down for the keynote address." I stepped around her, guiding Aaliyah to the head table, and took my seat. Kendra scoffed, tossing her hair over her shoulder, completely blind to the fact that her husband had just quietly ordered his fourth double scotch of the evening. She strutted back to Vivian's side, whispering in our mother's ear and pointing in my direction. They were both smiling, secure in their delusion that they had successfully isolated the problem child. 5 minutes later, the grand crystal chandeliers dimmed. The smooth jazz music faded into silence as the band stepped away from their instruments. A heavy, expectant hush fell over the massive ballroom. Hundreds of conversations stopped mid-sentence as all eyes turned toward the illuminated main stage. Jeremiah walked up the carpeted steps. He did not use a cane. He did not look like an aging patriarch losing his grip on his empire. He moved with the calculated, predatory strength of a man who owned the entire city block and everyone sitting inside of it. He stepped up to the acrylic podium and adjusted the microphone. The room was so quiet you could hear the ice clinking in the glasses. My mother sat up straight at her table, pasting on a radiant, loving expression, ready to bask in the reflected glory of her father's philanthropic speech. She even raised her phone, preparing to record the moment for her social media followers. Jeremiah looked out over the crowd. He bypassed the politicians. He bypassed the corporate titans. He locked eyes directly with me. For 3 decades, I have stood on this stage and spoken to you about the future of our community. Jeremiah began, his gravelly voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings with absolute unwavering authority. I have built this portfolio from the ground up, fighting for every single inch of territory. But an empire is only as strong as the person guarding the vault, and the time has come for the guard to change. He did not reach into his jacket for his usual 40-minute speech. He did not thank the generous donors or the politicians in the front row. He gripped the edges of the podium and delivered a statement that fractured the very foundation of Atlanta high society. "I am officially retiring," Jeremiah stated, the words striking the room like a thunderclap. He stepped entirely away from the podium, leaving the center of the stage completely empty. He raised his hand and pointed directly at me, slicing through the heavy silence of the ballroom. "My successor will take it from here." The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute and immediate. I let go of Aaliyah's hand, giving her a reassuring nod, as my grandfather's head of security gently guided her to a safe, reserved seat just out of the spotlight. I turned and walked toward the acrylic podium. Every step I took echoed against the marble floors and velvet curtains of Atlanta's elite. I passed the mayor. I passed the city council members. I passed the wealthy real estate developers who had spent decades trying to outmaneuver my grandfather. And then I passed my mother. Vivian looked like she had just been struck by a high-voltage electrical current. Her perfect poised posture had completely collapsed. The emerald green silk of her custom couture gown suddenly looked like a straitjacket binding her to her chair. She was gripping the edge of the linen tablecloth so hard her manicured acrylic nails were bending backward. She tried to catch my eye, silently begging me to preserve her reputation, pleading with me to keep our war confined to the shadows of the family estate. I looked right through her, as if she were made of glass. I stepped up the short staircase and took my place behind the microphone. The podium felt cool under my fingertips. I did not bring index cards or a written speech. I did not need them. I tapped the small remote control resting beside the microphone stand. Behind me, the massive digital projection screens that spanned the entire width of the ballroom flickered to life. The glowing corporate logo of my grandfather's real estate empire dissolved. It was instantly replaced by a massive, high-definition organizational chart detailing the executive structure of the corporate trust. For 30 years, Vivian had held a prominent honorary seat on that executive board. She used that title as a weapon to secure exclusive country club memberships, secure massive unsecured bank loans, and intimidate other socialites in her church circle. Right beneath her name on the old chart, Kendra had always occupied a specialized advisory tier. It was a fake position created entirely to funnel a six-figure allowance into her checking account so she could pretend to be a working woman on social media while actually spending her days at luxury boutiques. The chart currently glowing on the massive screens was completely restructured. Vivian's name was gone. Kendra's name was gone. The proxy access codes, the trust allowances, the generational safety nets were entirely wiped off the map. They had been digitally erased from the empire. At the very top of the corporate hierarchy, sitting directly beneath Jeremiah's name, was a single newly minted title: Chief Executive Officer and Sole Executor of the Silas Holdings Trust. Right next to that title was my name in bold black lettering. The collective gasp from the audience sounded like all the oxygen being violently sucked out of the room at once. Hundreds of millionaires and politicians stared at the glowing screen, their minds racing to process the hostile corporate takeover happening right in front of their faces. In our community, you do not publicly strip a matriarch of her title and cut a golden child out of the family business unless they have committed a sin so egregious it demands public execution. The whispers started instantly, a tidal wave of scandalized gossip rolling through the ballroom. People were already leaning across their tables, pulling out their phones, frantically messaging their networks. The black elite of Atlanta realized the empire had officially changed hands. Then came the scream. It was a raw, hysterical shriek that tore through the elegant atmosphere like a siren. Kendra shoved her dining chair back so violently it tipped over and crashed against the polished hardwood floor. She was on her feet, pointing a trembling diamond-covered finger directly at my face. "This is a joke!" Kendra shrieked, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic. Her perfectly styled hair whipped around her face as she looked frantically at the audience trying to garner sympathy. She manipulated him. My sister is a liar. She forced an elderly man to change his corporate trust because she is bitter and jealous of my marriage. Do not believe her. She is mentally unstable. I stood perfectly still at the podium watching her unravel. Kendra hitched up her sequined gown and took 3 aggressive steps toward the stage, fully intending to rush the stairs, rip the microphone out of my hands, and launch a physical altercation in front of the city's most powerful people. 2 of Jeremiah's massive private security guards stepped seamlessly into her path. They crossed their arms and blocked her ascent like brick walls. She slammed into them, bouncing off their tailored suits looking absolutely deranged. Denied access to the stage, Kendra spun around and looked for her usual savior. Liam, do something, she shrieked, her voice echoing terribly in the cavernous space. Call your corporate lawyers. Tell them about your investments. Tell them we are majority shareholders in the downtown properties. You are a tech founder. Use your leverage and stop her from stealing our money right now. The entire ballroom shifted their gaze to the sweaty, pale white man standing near the edge of the VIP table. Liam did not move. He was absolutely paralyzed. He was staring at me with the wide, terrified eyes of an animal caught in the headlights of an oncoming freight train. The glass of expensive scotch slipped from his trembling fingers and shattered on the floor, spilling amber liquid across the shoes of a city councilman. Liam knew he had no investments. He knew he was not a majority shareholder. He knew his tech startup was a ghost ship designed to hide stolen money. He opened his mouth, but his throat was so dry not a single sound emerged. He just stood there, letting his wife scream at him, publicly exposing the complete and utter lie of his existence. He looked at Vivian for help, but Vivian had covered her face with her hands, actively trying to hide from the flashing cameras of the local news reporters invited to cover the charity event. Kendra was practically hyperventilating now, demanding that Vivian back her up, demanding that anyone in the room validate her delusion. She looked toward the tables where her church aunties were seated, expecting them to rise up and defend the family honor. But the wealthy women just stared back at her with cold, calculating eyes. In high society, nobody ties their reputation to a sinking ship. The silence from her allies was deafening. I let Kendra scream for exactly 15 more seconds, allowing the entire congregation of Atlanta's elite to witness her absolute lack of emotional regulation and her complete detachment from reality. I let them see the spoiled, entitled child who thought it was acceptable to abandon my daughter in a store for attention. Then I leaned into the microphone. Kendra, you want to talk about your husband's investments, I said, my voice echoing with a calm, terrifying clarity that instantly sliced through her hysteria and silenced the room. Let us take a very close look at his impressive financial portfolio. I raised my hand and pressed the button on the remote control a second time. The massive screens behind me shifted violently. The organizational chart disappeared. In its place, illuminated in high definition and blown up to be 20 feet tall, were the scanned copies of the forged commercial mortgages. The audience murmured in confusion before I clicked the button again, displaying the fraudulent contractor invoices from the offshore shell companies. I zoomed in on the vendor names, placing them side by side with Liam's personal banking routing numbers, and stamped at the bottom of every single document, large enough for the mayor in the front row to read perfectly, was Liam's unmistakable, legally binding signature, authorizing the theft of millions of dollars. The glowing signature on the massive screens hung over the ballroom like a death sentence. I let the visual sink into the minds of every politician, investor, and socialite in the room before I leaned back into the microphone. My voice cut through the stunned silence, crystal clear and entirely devoid of mercy. As my first official act as Chief Executive Officer of Silas Holdings, I have concluded a full forensic audit of our internal operations. I did not just look at the corporate accounts. I audited the philanthropic branches. The ledgers you are looking at right now document a systematic multi-year embezzlement scheme. Over the last 4 years, Liam has siphoned exactly $1.2 million directly from this family's community development fund. A collective gasp ripped through the crowd. This was no longer just a corporate dispute or a private family scandal. The Community Development Fund was the sacred heart of my grandfather's legacy. It was the specific financial vehicle used to build affordable housing fund, historically black colleges, and provide capital for minority-owned small businesses across Atlanta. By stealing from that specific fund, Liam had not just robbed Jeremiah. He had robbed the very community represented by every single person sitting in that ballroom. The wealthy guests who had been sipping champagne just moments ago suddenly turned their collective gaze toward the VIP table. The polite curiosity in their eyes hardened into absolute revulsion. The mayor lowered his expression turning to stone. The church aunties who had condemned me on Sunday were now staring at Liam as if he were a demon manifested in a tailored tuxedo. Liam finally snapped out of his paralysis. The sheer weight of hundreds of furious eyes pressing down on him triggered a blind, animalistic fight-or-flight response. He chose flight. He lunged backward, shoving his dining chair away so violently it crashed into the knees of a prominent city councilman. He did not apologize. He did not look at his wife. He turned his back on Kendra and bolted for the grand mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom. He scrambled past the round tables, his expensive dress shoes slipping frantically on the polished marble floor. He was sweating profusely, his face twisted in raw terror, shoving past a waiter carrying a tray of champagne flutes. Crystals shattered across the floor, but Liam kept running, desperate to escape the blinding spotlight of his own crimes. He was 50 feet from the exit, then 30, then 10. He reached out to push the heavy brass handles of the ballroom doors, but a solid wall of human muscle materialized seamlessly in his path. Marcus and David, the lead agents of my grandfather's private security detail, stepped out from the shadows of the vestibule. They did not draw weapons. They did not even raise their voices. They simply crossed their massive arms and stood shoulder to shoulder, completely blocking the only exit. Liam slammed his hands against Marcus's chest, trying to physically shove his way out. It was like watching a desperate bird flutter against a reinforced concrete wall. Marcus did not budge a single inch. He just looked down at Liam with an expression of profound disgust, placing one massive hand flat against Liam's sternum and shoving him backward. Liam stumbled, tripping over his own feet, and fell hard onto the marble floor right in front of the locked doors. The elite crowd watched in collective shock as the smug, entitled brother-in-law was trapped like a rat in a glittering cage. Nobody moved to help him. Not a single politician, lawyer, or socialite lifted a finger. They just watched their cell phones held high, recording every pathetic second of his downfall. I stood at the podium watching him scramble backward on his hands and knees. "You thought you were untouchable, Liam," I said into the microphone. My voice echoed across the massive room, pinning him to the floor. "You walked into my grandfather's house, ate his food, drank his wine, and smiled in his face while you actively drained the resources meant to uplift our people. You thought you could steal from a black empire to fund your mediocre, fabricated lifestyle because you assumed we were not smart enough to check the math. You relied on your own arrogant prejudice. You assumed the old man was too tired and his daughter was too vain to ever notice the missing capital." I paused, letting the absolute truth of his racism and entitlement hang in the air for the entire city to witness. "But you forgot one very important thing." I continued, my tone dropping to a lethal whisper that commanded the attention of every soul in the building. "I am a forensic accountant. I do not care about your country club memberships. I do not care about your social connections. I follow the money. And your money leads straight to a federal penitentiary." I lifted my chin and nodded deliberately toward the back of the room. The heavy side doors near the service corridor swung open. They did not rush the room. They walked with the slow, measured pace of absolute authority. Two agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Economic Crimes Division stepped into the ballroom. They wore dark suits, their badges gleaming clearly against their belts. The crowd parted instantly, creating a wide, clear path for the federal agents. They walked straight past the silent tables, past the shocked politicians, and stopped directly in front of Liam, who was still trembling on the floor. Liam's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked wildly toward the VIP table, searching for the women who had enabled him for nearly a decade. But Kendra was frozen in her chair, weeping hysterically into her hands, completely incapable of processing the destruction of her fake reality. One of the agents reached down, grabbed Liam by the collar of his expensive tuxedo, and hauled him roughly to his feet. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut echoed sharply through the silent ballroom. The sound was definitive. It was the sound of a parasite finally being ripped away from its host. The agent began reciting his Miranda rights, the words cutting through the heavy, perfumed air of the gala. The reality of the situation finally broke through Vivian's narcissistic delusion. She had spent the last 10 minutes trying to hide from the flashing cameras, hoping the scandal would somehow pass her by. But as she watched her son-in-law being shackled by federal agents in front of every prominent socialite and church leader in Atlanta, her survival instincts overrode her maternal loyalty. She realized that her reputation, her entire identity within the black elite, was currently being loaded into the back of a federal transport vehicle. She needed a scapegoat, and she needed one instantly. Vivian scrambled out of her chair. She pushed past a sobbing Kendra and lunged toward the jazz band's stage setup near the VIP section. She frantically grabbed a secondary microphone from its stand, the feedback whining sharply as she fumbled with the power switch. She turned to face the crowd, her chest heaving, tears of pure self-preservation streaming down her perfectly contoured face. "I had no idea!" Vivian shrieked into the microphone, her voice shrill and desperate, bouncing off the crystal chandeliers. "Everyone listen to me. I swear to you before God, I had absolutely no idea what he was doing. My son-in-law acted completely alone. He manipulated us. He used our trust to steal from this community. Kendra and I are victims. We are victims of his deception." She threw the man her daughter loved directly to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. She stood in front of hundreds of people and proudly denied any involvement, hoping the crowd would forget that she was the one who had physically logged into the banking portals to grant him administrative access. She was attempting to rewrite history in real time, desperately trying to salvage whatever microscopic shred of her social standing remained. She pointed a trembling finger at the handcuffed man being led toward the exit, performing the role of the betrayed matriarch with sickening enthusiasm. I stood at the main podium, my hands resting lightly on the acrylic edges. I watched my mother sell out her favorite daughter's husband just to save her own skin. I did not raise my voice to shout over her theatrical sobbing. I simply leaned into my microphone and smiled, a cold, terrifying expression that made the front row flinch. "Oh, Mother," I whispered, the amplified sound rolling smoothly over her frantic screams. "We aren't finished yet." My voice reverberated through the silent ballroom, carrying a promise of absolute destruction. Vivian stood near the jazz band stage, clutching her stolen microphone, her chest heaving as she desperately tried to maintain her posture. She actually thought she had won. She believed that by sacrificing Liam, she had cleanly severed the infected limb and saved her own pristine reputation. I watched the arrogant relief wash over her face as she looked out at the crowd expecting their sympathy. I did not give her a single second to enjoy her delusion. I raised my hand and pressed the central button on my presentation remote. The high-definition scans of the forged mortgages vanished from the massive screens behind me. They were instantly replaced by a stark black background, displaying a simple glowing audio waveform. The ballroom speakers, which just moments ago had been broadcasting my mother's frantic lies, now crackled to life with a completely different sound. It was the distinct ambient noise of the artisan coffee shop from yesterday afternoon, followed immediately by Liam's frantic, hyperventilating voice. "Camille, listen to me," Liam's recorded voice begged, echoing off the crystal chandeliers with terrifying clarity. "I did not do this alone. I am not the mastermind here. Vivian gave me the administrative proxy keys. I could not have bypassed the internal controls without her. She physically logged into the portal from her laptop and authorized the shell companies. She knew exactly what I was doing." A collective shudder ripped through the elite crowd. The mayor actually took a physical step backward, putting distance between himself and my mother's table. The church aunties who had proudly condemned me just days ago were now staring at Vivian with their mouths hanging open, their eyes wide with unapologetic horror. But the recording was not finished. Liam's desperate voice continued to echo, filling every corner of the grand venue. And Kendra, Liam's audio, continued speaking faster and faster, throwing his own wife directly into the line of fire. Kendra demanded the money. "Do you have any idea how much it costs to keep her happy? The designer closed the vacations, the cars. She knew I was not making money from the startup. She knew the cash was coming from your grandfather's accounts. She told me to take it. She told me Jeremiah owed it to her because he favored you and Aaliyah. They manipulated me, Camille. I tapped the remote, cutting the audio file off. The silence that rushed back into the room was heavy enough to crush bone. I looked down at the VIP table. The destruction of the golden child was happening in real time. Kendra had just heard her own husband, the man she had worshipped and funded with stolen wealth, sell her out to a federal auditor without a single second of hesitation. Her entire fabricated reality shattered into a million jagged pieces. The illusion of her perfect marriage, the fake tech startup, the unearned superiority, it was all gone. She was not a wealthy socialite. She was an unaddicted co-conspirator. Kendra's knees gave out. She collapsed hard into her dining chair, the heavy sequined fabric of her expensive gown bunching up awkwardly around her waist. She began to sob uncontrollably, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. She looked wildly toward the exit, but the federal agents had already marched Liam out of the building. She was completely alone. Desperate for a savior. Kendra turned her tear-streaked face toward the stage where Vivian was standing. "Mom," she wailed, her voice cracking with raw, childlike panic. "Mom, tell them he is lying. Tell them we did not know. You have to fix this. Do something. Call the lawyers." But Vivian did not move to comfort her favorite daughter. The fiercely protective mother, who had spent 29 years enabling Kendra's every whim, was suddenly nowhere to be found. Vivian was too busy realizing that the local news cameras positioned at the back of the room had captured every single second of the audio playback. Her perfect Atlanta society reputation was currently being live-streamed. She dropped the microphone. It hit the hardwood stage with a loud, obnoxious squeal of feedback. She raised both hands to her face, desperately trying to shield herself from the relentless flashing lights of the society photographers. When the ship finally sank, the captain did not go down with it. She actively hid behind her own hands, leaving her golden child to drown. I stood at the podium, looking out over the wreckage of my biological family. I did not yell. I did not need to raise my voice to project my power. I leaned into the microphone and delivered the final verdict with a cold, clinical precision that cut through the sounds of Kendra's weeping. "You did not just steal money," I stated, my gaze locked directly onto my mother's trembling shoulders. "You stole my college tuition. You drained my educational trust fund to pay for a destination wedding in the Bahamas so you could parade your favorite daughter in front of these exact same people. You stole my peace of mind for 33 years, telling me I was never enough, while you secretly funded a life of luxury using stolen capital." I paused, letting the weight of the theft settle over the silent crowd. The guests were completely captivated, watching a generational trauma be dismantled under the bright lights of a charity gala. And then I continued, my voice dropping to a dangerous, unyielding register. "As your final act of supreme entitlement, you abandoned my 7-year-old child in a massive retail store simply because you were jealous of the heir," she breathed. "You put my daughter in danger because you could not stand the fact that her brilliant light outshined your pathetic fake jewelry. I promised myself I would audit every single thing you touched. I did, and you are done." The absolute finality of my words broke whatever fragile psychological dam Vivian was using to hold herself together. Her social currency was bankrupt. Her bank accounts were federally frozen. Her golden child was sobbing in a ruined dress, and her son-in-law was sitting in the back of an FBI transport vehicle. She had absolutely zero leverage left. She had one final card to play. Vivian turned away from the cameras and stumbled off the small jazz stage. She did not look at me. She bypassed the podium completely and scrambled directly toward the center table where my grandfather Jeremiah was seated. She was hyperventilating, her custom emerald gown dragging against the spilled champagne on the marble floor. She reached his table and did the unthinkable. The proud, arrogant matriarch of high society physically collapsed. She fell to her knees right in front of Jeremiah's chair, the heavy silk of her dress pooling around her like a deflated parachute. She reached out with trembling hands and grabbed the fabric of his tailored tuxedo trousers. "Daddy, please," Vivian sobbed, her voice stripped of all its former aristocratic polish. She sounded like a desperate, terrified animal. "Please do not let her do this to me. I made a mistake. I was just trying to protect my family. You cannot let them take me away. I am your only child. I am your flesh and blood. You have to give me grace, Daddy. Please have mercy on me." The crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see if the ruthless patriarch would break, waiting to see if the bonds of blood would override the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. I just watched from the podium, resting my hands lightly on the acrylic edges, a cold, satisfied smile touching the corners of my mouth. I knew my grandfather better than anyone in that room. He did not build his empire by forgiving parasites. The trap had closed perfectly. The ballroom remained perfectly still. The only sound was the pathetic, ragged gasps escaping my mother's throat as she clung to the hem of my grandfather's tailored trousers. Jeremiah did not pull away immediately. He looked down at the woman he had raised, the woman he had given every conceivable advantage in this world. The disappointment in his eyes was so profound, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the room. He reached out and gently but firmly pried her manicured fingers off his suit. He stepped around her kneeling form and walked straight back to the acrylic podium. I stepped aside, yielding the microphone to the patriarch. Jeremiah gripped the edges of the podium. He did not yell. He spoke with a quiet, devastating certainty that echoed through the silence of the grand ballroom. "You look at me and beg for grace, Vivian," he said, his voice hard as granite. "You ask for mercy in the name of family. But you do not know the meaning of the word. A mother protects her young. A daughter honors her father's legacy. You did neither. You fed my life's work to a parasite so your favorite child could wear designer clothes. You stole your own daughter's tuition. And you left my great-granddaughter alone in a store because you were jealous of a 7-year-old child." Vivian let out a strangled wail, burying her face in her hands. "You aren't my daughter anymore," Jeremiah stated. The words landed like a judge's gavel. "You are a parasite." He raised his head and addressed the hundreds of elite guests, politicians, and business leaders watching the spectacle. He was securing his legacy and publicly severing the infected branches of our family tree in one swift motion. "Let it be known here and now," Jeremiah announced. "Vivian and Kendra are officially disinherited. Effective immediately, they are stripped of all titles, all proxy access, and all trust allowances. Their corporate credit cards have been canceled. They are legally barred from stepping foot on any property owned by Silas Holdings, including the residential estate. They have zero authority to speak on behalf of this family or this company ever again." Kendra screamed from her table, a high-pitched sound of pure denial. She tried to stand up, but her legs gave out. Marcus David Jeremiah commanded, nodding to his lead security agents, who were already moving toward the VIP section. "Escort these women off my property." The execution was swift and merciless. Marcus pulled Vivian to her feet, ignoring her frantic pleas. David flanked Kendra, guiding her firmly by the arm. They were marched straight down the center aisle of the ballroom, following the exact same path Liam had taken in handcuffs just minutes earlier. There was no sympathy from the crowd. The wealthy socialites and church aunties who had spent years kissing up to my mother now turned their backs, whispering in disgust. Some even clapped lightly, a polite, chilling applause for the swift delivery of justice. They were watching the absolute social and financial annihilation of two women who had built their entire identities on unearned superiority. I watched the heavy wooden doors of the ballroom close behind them. The oppressive energy they always brought into a room vanished with them. The air suddenly felt clean and light. I stepped down from the stage. The elite crowd parted for me, murmurs of awe and respect following in my wake. I did not stop to network or accept congratulations. I walked straight to the reserved table where my daughter was waiting safely with the security detail. I scooped Aaliyah into my arms. She wrapped her little arms tightly around my neck and rested her head on my shoulder. I held her close, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo. The war was over. The natural consequences of their actions arrived with brutal efficiency over the next 6 months. Justice does not require cruelty. It simply requires the removal of the safety net. Without my grandfather's wealth to prop them up, their fabricated realities collapsed entirely. Liam was formally indicted on multiple counts of federal wire fraud and money laundering. Without Vivian to pay for a high-powered defense team, he was assigned a public defender who quickly advised him to take a plea deal. He was currently serving time in a federal correctional facility, paying the price for his unearned arrogance. Kendra left drowning in a mountain of legal debt and possessing absolutely zero real-world skills was forced to face the reality of the working class she had always mocked. The luxury cars were repossessed. Her designer wardrobe was sold off in online consignment shops just to make rent. She was forced to take a minimum wage retail job at a suburban mall. The irony was poetic. The woman who had abandoned my daughter in a retail store to teach her humility was now spending 40 hours a week folding shirts in one. Vivian suffered the most catastrophic fall. She was permanently excommunicated from her elite social circles. The country club revoked her membership. The church community that once hung on her every word now treated her like a pariah, citing her fraudulent actions as a stain on their congregation. With her bank accounts frozen and the estate seized, she was forced to move into a tiny rundown apartment on the outskirts of the city. Her reputation was completely and utterly ruined. She had traded a life of guaranteed luxury for empty vanity, and she lost both. About a year after the gala, a thick envelope arrived at my corporate office. It was handwritten bearing Vivian's cramped, frantic script. I did not need to open it to know what was inside. It was a manipulative, tearful apology letter begging for financial help. She probably wrote about how much she missed me, how family should forgive each other, how God wants us to show mercy. She would never take actual accountability for stealing my tuition or endangering my child. She just wanted access to the vault again. I did not open it. I took a red pen, wrote "Return to Sender" across the front in bold letters, and handed it back to my executive assistant. I refused to entertain fake forgiveness. I refused to let toxic people back into my life simply because we shared a bloodline. I broke the generational curse of tolerating abuse under the guise of family loyalty. My peace was non-negotiable. I sat back in the heavy leather chair in the corner office of Silas Holdings. The mahogany desk that had once held the evidence of their crimes was now covered in blueprints for a new affordable housing development we were funding. The door to my office swung open. Aaliyah skipped inside carrying her violin case and a fresh sheet of music. She dropped her backpack on the plush rug and happily settled onto the floor, humming a bright, joyful tune as she organized her music notes. Jeremiah walked in right behind her. He was holding 2 cups of black coffee from the artisan cafe downstairs. He set one down on my desk, a genuine, profound pride shining in his eyes. He looked lighter, as if the burden of carrying parasites for decades had finally been lifted from his shoulders. I took a sip of the hot coffee and turned my chair to look out the floor-to-ceiling windows. The Atlanta skyline stretched out before me, a sprawling landscape of glass, steel, and endless opportunity. The city was vibrant and alive, completely untainted by the shadows of my past. I watched the sunset, reflect off the buildings, secure in my power, my wealth, and my hard-won independence. I realized that the family I had built with my brilliant daughter and my resilient grandfather was the only one I ever needed. The parasites were gone, the ledger was permanently balanced, and my empire had just begun. True family is defined by mutual respect and unconditional support rather than just shared blood. When toxic relatives use your loyalty to manipulate and steal from you, walking away is not a failure, but a profound act of survival. You do not owe your peace to people who consistently choose their own vanity over your health. Healing begins the moment you stop seeking validation from those incapable of giving it and start building an independent life on your own terms. Please share your experience with setting family boundaries in the comments below and subscribe for more empowering stories right now.